Midnight, August 1791. The cane fields hissed as fire devoured them, flames racing like wild beasts through the stalks. Smoke bled into the sky, turning it red, turning it black. Screams rose from the grand house on the hill, their echoes carried by the wind like a hymn of the damned. Chains lay broken in the dirt, still warm from bodies that once wore them. A figure stood before the burning mansion, his face hidden in shadow, his silence louder than the chaos around him. He did not beg. He did not run. He burned. The sun rose heavy over Saint-Domingue, its heat pressing down on the island like a punishment. The cane fields shimmered, endless rows bending under the weight of dew, their sweetness masking the stench of sweat and rot. From the hills, the great houses stood white and proud, but their foundations were laid on bones. The overseer's bell clanged. Men and women shuffled into the fields, chains rattling with each step. Their backs bore scars, some old and silvery, some fresh and red. Work songs rose, faint at first, beaten down by exhaustion. Etienne Moreau rode his mule along the rows, boots muddy with dried blood. He carried a whip coiled at his side, his other hand clutching a flask of cheap rum. His words were always slurred, yet sharp enough to cut. "Faster, dogs. The sun doesn't wait for your misery," he spat, letting the rum burn down his throat. Marie-Claire knelt by the river, scrubbing shirts already stiff with dried blood. She hummed under her breath a soft lullaby in Creole, a tune she had learned from her grandmother. It was a song meant for babies, not for rags soaked in pain. She glanced up as Etienne passed, eyes down quickly again before his gaze could linger. By the market road, wagons brought new flesh, men shackled 2 by 2, women dragged with collars of iron. The cries of children punctured the air, their arms outstretched to mothers who could not answer. A merchant barked numbers as if counting cattle. In the distance, drums sounded. Not loud, not close, but steady. Etienne froze for a moment, frowning. He took another swallow from his flask. "Drums again," he muttered. "Always drums." Marie-Claire heard them too. She scrubbed harder, her voice low, singing the lullaby against the rhythm. One of the younger women beside her whispered, "It's a call. They're gathering." Marie-Claire silenced her with a sharp shake of the head. "Do not speak it. Do not even think it. Not with his ears near." Etienne cracked the whip against the ground, the sound like a gunshot. The field hands bent lower, cutting cane with trembling arms. Sweat stung open wounds. The sun offered no mercy. At the great house, the planter's wife appeared briefly on the balcony, her lace gown fluttering. She held a parasol, sipping coffee sweetened with sugar cut by the same men bleeding in the fields. She watched with idle curiosity, as though looking at beasts in a pit. Then she vanished inside, shutters closing. Marie-Claire wrung the last of the shirts, blood and river water swirling together before sinking downstream. She whispered to herself, "One day, it will not be us." Her hands shook as she tucked the lullaby back into her throat. A secret kept alive. The drums beat again, carried on the wind, too faint for Etienne's drunken ears. But for those who listened closely, the message was clear. The island was breathing, waiting, ready. Night fell heavy on the plantation, the air thick with the smell of cane and sweat. The field hands gathered in silence around a dying fire, eyes darting to the shadows where the overseer might lurk. From among them, a man drew a small object from his pocket, a charm carved from a broken drumstick. He ran his thumb across its grooves like one might over a scar. This was Jean-François Papillon, once a boy stolen from a distant shore, now a man whose silence carried the weight of storms. He spoke little, but when he did, his voice cut clean. "My mother sang to me when the slavers came," he said softly, staring into the embers. "A lullaby. I hear it still. It tells me chains do not last forever." Beside him, a woman leaned forward, eyes reflecting firelight. Cécile Fatiman carried herself like flame, restless, dangerous, never still. Her hands smelled of smoke and herbs, her hair tied back with a strip of cloth where a black rooster's feather was tucked. She hissed at Jean-François. "Chains break when fire eats them, not before." She pressed the feather into the earth as though to bind her words in blood. A laugh broke the tension. Georges Biassou sat cross-legged, his broad shoulders casting shadows across the circle. He traced the line of a scar that cut from his ear down to his jaw. His laughter was sharp, but it never touched his eyes. "You speak of fire, Cécile. Jean speaks of songs. Me, I speak of steel. Cane knives cut more than cane." He held up the blade, its edge dull but dangerous. One day it will taste sweeter blood. A younger boy listening whispered nervously, "If the whites hear you," George barked back, "let them hear." "What will they do?" "Kill us twice." Jean-Francois placed his talisman back into his pocket. His tone was calm, but it carried command. "Not tonight. Not here, but soon. We speak like this and we live. We stay silent and we die with nothing." Cécile leaned closer, her voice low, almost chanting. "The spirits wait. They whisper in the rustling cane. They ask us, do we fear chains? Or do chains fear us?" The circle fell silent. The fire cracked, sparks rising into the night like spirits set free. Jean-Francois glanced toward the great house on the hill, its windows glowing faintly. He murmured almost to himself, "I will see it burn. My mother's lullaby will be louder than their screams." George clapped a hand on his shoulder, firm, brotherly. "Then we will be there to hear it together." And Cécile's eyes glimmered like oil catching flame. "Yes, together. And the fire will not stop until it reaches the sea." The night held its breath. The drums from distant hills began again, faint but certain. The message threaded through their bones. Patience, planning, power. The chapel bell rang faintly across the plantation, its tone more suited for the dead than the living. Jean-Francois lingered in the shadows of the old stone wall, waiting. The night was thick with crickets, the air swollen with heat. A figure approached quietly, a lantern hooded in her hand. Adeline Laurent stepped into view. Her hair, dark as her mother's, was tucked neatly under a bonnet. She moved with grace, but her eyes darted nervously. She was the planter's daughter, yet not truly his. Born of his violence against an enslaved woman, a secret dressed in silk. She carried a small hymn book pressed tightly to her chest. Jean-Francois whispered, "You should not be here." She gave a small, defiant smile. "And yet I am." She opened the hymn book, revealing a folded scrap of parchment hidden between the pages. "Letters," she said. "Words of liberty. From France. From the Revolution. They speak of rights, of men made equal." Jean-Francois took the letter carefully, his rough fingers brushing hers. "Rights," he repeated, the word foreign on his tongue, bitter and sweet at once. Adeline leaned closer, voice low. "If my father knew, he would burn me alive. But still, I want you to read them. I want you to know." From behind the wall, a voice interrupted. "She risks more than you think." An older man stepped into the circle of lantern light. Tinoel, his back bent but his eyes sharp, carried a small bundle wrapped in cloth. His hands smelled of crushed leaves and earth. Once a follower of the poisoned rebel Macandal, he was keeper of dangerous secrets. He placed the bundle down, revealing small vials filled with murky liquids. "Poison," he said plainly. "Hidden in calabash gourds, it can kill a master as quickly as fever. Knowledge is sharper than steel. But knowledge alone is a death sentence if spoken too loud." Adeline looked from him to Jean-Francois. "Then you must whisper it, hide it. Carry it." Tinoel gave a crooked smile. "I have carried it longer than you've drawn breath, girl." Jean-Francois studied the vials, then looked back at Adeline's hymn book. Letters, poison, songs, fire. He shook his head slowly. All threads in one rope. A rustle came from the trees. Out stepped a young man, tall, lean, with the build of a servant boy hardened by labor. Henri Christophe. His eyes were bright with hunger, not for food but for something greater. He clutched a polished spoon in his hand, holding it like a dagger. "Give me a blade," he said, his voice trembling with eagerness, "and I'll gut them where they stand." Tinoel chuckled darkly. "Steel will come. For now, learn patience. Even kings must crawl before they walk." Henri's chin lifted. "Then I will crawl faster than any king." Jean-Francois's gaze lingered on him, measuring. "You will fight, but you will also wait. If you strike too soon, you strike alone. Do you wish to die alone, boy?" Henri gritted his teeth, then lowered the spoon. "No, not alone." Adeline reached out, placing the hymn book against Jean-Francois's chest. "Then promise me, when you rise, you will read these words aloud. Not just for vengeance, but for freedom. For something greater." Jean-Francois's voice dropped to a murmur. "Greater than vengeance? I cannot yet see it, but I promise to look." The night deepened, their gathering hidden but fragile. From the distance, the overseer's laughter echoed faintly across the fields, carried by rum and cruelty. Cécile Fatiman emerged from the dark, her eyes blazing. She had listened unseen. Dreams and letters are sweet, but spirits demand blood. They demand oath. She pressed her rooster feather into the ground. "One day under the ceiba tree you will swear, and the drums will answer." Jean-Francois closed his fist over his wooden talisman. He looked at each of them. Adeline with her forbidden love, Tinoel with his poisons, Henri with his restless hunger, Cécile with her fire. Bonds were forming, dangerous and fragile, but shadows moved too. From beyond the cane rows, unseen eyes watched. A clerk with ink-stained hands kept to the dark, quill broken in his pocket. Benoit Chaville listened, and he smiled thinly. The moon was high when the circle gathered beneath the ceiba tree. The air smelled of smoke and damp earth. Jean-Francois held his talisman, thumb pressing into the carved wood. Georges Biassou leaned against the trunk, scar glinting pale under the starlight. Cécile Fatima set her rooster feather down in the soil, whispering a chant. Adeline clutched her hymn book tightly. "Tonight we decide," she whispered. Words steel or poison, but no more waiting. Tinoel uncorked a vial, letting its bitter scent drift. Waiting keeps us alive, acting without timing. The crack of a whip cut through the night. Torches flared. Men with muskets stormed the clearing. At their head rode Etienne Moreau, drunk but grinning like a wolf. Beside him, his lantern swinging, walked Benoit Chaville, the clerk, his ink-stained fingers wrapped around a broken quill. "Thought you could hide your secrets in shadows," Benoit sneered. "But shadows belong to me. I write them down." Jean-Francois's jaw tightened. Georges sprang forward only to be struck across the face with a musket butt. He fell, blood spraying across the roots of the ceiba. Etienne raised his whip, eyes gleaming. "Which one first? The silent one or the loud one?" He pointed at Georges and then at Jean-Francois. "No, the scarred dog. He bleeds prettier." They dragged Georges to the ground, stripped his shirt away. The first lash tore flesh, the second painted the soil. Georges bit down on his lip until blood poured from his mouth. Marie-Claire pulled from her washing to witness, stood trembling at the edge of the torchlight. She whispered her lullaby through clenched teeth, desperate to drown out the sound of the whip. Jean-Francois stepped forward, but Etienne pressed the musket to Adeline's chest. "Move and she dies." Benoit leaned close, his words dripping venom. "Ink can drown a man as surely as blood. Your names are already on my page. You are finished." Jean-Francois met his eyes. His voice was low, steady, carved in stone. "Ink will dry. Blood will not," Etienne laughed, the whip snapping again. "Beg me, boy. Beg me, and maybe I'll stop." Georges lifted his head, blood running down his back. His voice was hoarse but unbroken. "I will not beg." The lash fell again. Cécile's nails dug into her palms until blood welled. Her whisper rose into a chant, so quiet only those closest heard. "Spirits take note. Blood has been offered." When Georges finally collapsed, the men tossed him at Jean-Francois's feet, broken but alive. Etienne spat, swinging back onto his mule. "Next time we finish it." Benoit lingered, holding up the broken quill as though it were a dagger. "Remember me when the ink dries?" They vanished into the night, torches fading. The circle was shattered. Jean-Francois knelt beside Georges, pressing the talisman into his friend's bloodied hand. "You live." "That is enough," Georges' voice rasped. "Not enough. Never enough. We burn them, Jean, all of them." Cécile's chant grew louder, eyes wild. "Chains break only in fire. The spirits have chosen their moment." Adeline clutched the hymn book against her chest, tears streaking her face. "You must be careful." Jean-Francois rose slowly, his face shadowed but fierce. "No, careful has ended. They wanted blood. Now they will drown in it." The drums from the hills answered, pounding like a heartbeat. The cane fields swayed under the heavy dawn, stalks glittering with dew. A wind whispered across the plantation, carrying the rhythm of distant drums. Jean-Francois stood in the furrows, sickle in hand, but his eyes burned with something sharper than labor. Tinoel joined him, slipping a rusted blade beneath the cut stalks. "3 more hidden here. The overseer will not look under cane." Jean-Francois nodded. "And the powder?" Tinoel smirked, tapping the burlap sack slung over his shoulder. "Stolen from the port warehouse. The Spaniards will notice, but too late." From the path, Adeline appeared with a basket of cassava bread. She walked like any market girl, but her fingers clutched folded paper between the loaves. She placed it at Jean-Francois's feet. "Maps," she whispered. "Drawn by the priest's apprentice. Every road, every garrison." Her eyes darted to the watchtower. Hide them before the guards search again. Cécile approached next, her hair wild, carrying a clay jar of herbs. This will keep wounds from festering, she said, though her voice trembled. But do not ask for miracles. Spirits demand blood for blood. Georges Biassou limped forward, back raw with half-healed scars. His steps were slow, but his voice was iron. Scars are reminders, not chains. We turned them into weapons. They circled beneath the mango trees, planning in broken whispers. Jean-François. We strike at the bell tower. When it rings for prayer, their guard drops, Tinoel. We take torches from the cane mill. Dry husks catch fire fast, Georges. And the masters? Jean-François' eyes darkened. No mercy, the wind shifted. Boots crunched on gravel. Etienne Moreau's laugh echoed as he strode toward the mill. Whip coiled at his hip. Soldiers trailed him, muskets resting lazily on shoulders. Hide it, Adeline hissed, shoving the papers back into her basket. Tinoel pushed the sack of powder beneath the cane. Jean-François dropped the sickle, stooping as though merely harvesting. Etienne stopped near them, his eyes narrowing. You there, boy with the scarred friend, what are you whispering? Jean-François looked up, sweat glistening. The stalk is dry. I said it would not yield much. Etienne's grin spread cruelly. Dry? Like your tongue will be when I cut it out. He let the whip snap across the cane, splitting a stalk in half. The soldiers laughed. He leaned close, breath reeking of rum. You think I don't smell secrets on you? Remember, dog, I own your silence, Jean-François bowed his head. Yes, master. His voice was steady, but his hand clenched so hard around the cane stalk that splinters pierced his palm. Etienne spat at his feet and swaggered on, his laughter trailing like smoke. When the soldiers vanished, Adeline exhaled shakily. One word wrong and we'd all hang. Jean-François lifted his bloodied palm, closing it around the talisman. One day soon his laugh will stop. The drums from the hills answered again, louder now, carrying the promise of fire. The bell tower tolled midnight. Its iron voice rolled across the plantation like a funeral knell. The cane fields, usually hushed, now bristled with shadows moving between the rows. Torches flared one by one, tiny sparks of defiance. Jean-François stood at the center, talisman in hand, his scarred palm wrapped tight around it. Beside him, Tinoel carried the stolen powder, Adeline held the maps, and Cécile clutched her clay jar of herbs. Georges Biassou leaned on a broken musket, his face lit by firelight. Jean-François' voice was low, sharp, no turning back. Tonight, chains break or we burn with them. Tinoel grinned, teeth flashing. Then let it burn. They moved toward the great house, flames licking higher as Cain caught fire behind them. The air filled with smoke, thick and choking. A distant cry rose, half terror, half war chant. Inside the mansion, Etienne Moreau staggered from his chamber, half drunk, robe loose around his shoulders. He blinked at the glow outside. What devilry? A servant burst in, eyes wide. Master! The slaves, they're rising. Etienne slapped him to the floor. Fool, they wouldn't dare. He snatched his whip, the leather hissing like a snake. But outside, the dare had already become truth. The gates of the cane mill crashed open. Dozens of enslaved men and women poured forth, carrying machetes, axes, even burning branches. Their voices rose together in a thunderous cry, Liberté ou mort, freedom or death. Etienne's soldiers scrambled, muskets clattering as they fumbled with powder and shot. But smoke blinded them. Torches flew through the air and fire raced up the cane like a furious tide. Jean-François charged first, blade flashing. A soldier lifted his musket, too late. The steel sank into his throat and he fell with a gurgled scream. Cécile dashed forward, pressing cloth to Georges' bleeding arm where a musket ball grazed him. Stay alive, she hissed. Stay alive to see them fall. Adeline dragged a torch across the granary door, sparks bursting into flame. For every night we starved, she cried. Etienne staggered out into the courtyard, whip raised. His voice cracked with fury. Dogs, back to your chains! Jean-François turned toward him, chest heaving, eyes burning red with firelight. No chains tonight, they clashed, whip against blade. Etienne lashed, striking Jean-François' shoulder, ripping skin. But Jean-François did not flinch. With a roar, he drove the machete across his master's chest. Etienne stumbled, gasping, clutching at the wound. Tinoel hurled the stolen powder onto the flames. A deafening blast shook the ground, sending soldiers and servants sprawling. The sky glowed hellish red, sparks raining down like falling stars. Amid the chaos, a boy no older than 12 clung to a torch, eyes wide with both terror and wonder. Jean-Francois caught his gaze. "Run to the hills," he ordered. "Tell them we are free." The boy nodded and vanished into the night. Etienne lay on the ground, blood pooling beneath him. He coughed, spitting red, voice trembling. "You will hang for this." Jean-Francois stood over him, whip coiled at his feet. His voice was calm, deadly. "No, you will burn." He dropped the torch onto Etienne's robe. Flames leapt greedily, swallowing silk, then flesh. Etienne screamed, thrashing, his body igniting like dry cane. The sound carried across the plantation, mingling with the chant of the uprising. Liberté ou mort. The slaves surged onward, storming the mansion, tearing down portraits, smashing silver goblets, throwing open storerooms of food. Years of hunger erupted into frenzy. Adeline found herself staring at the grand piano, its polished wood gleaming. Slowly, she set her torch upon it. As flames consumed the instrument, the last echoes of the master's lullabies shrieked out in warped, burning strings. In the distance, other plantations answered with fire. Hills glowed with rebellion. Smoke curled into the heavens like a dark prayer. Jean-Francois, bloodied but unbowed, raised his blade to the sky. This is only the beginning. And the beginning roared back, fire upon fire, until the night itself seemed to burn. The plantation was an inferno. Flames roared through cane fields, licking the night sky. The ground shook with the thunder of boots, screams, drums, and gunfire. Smoke smothered the stars. Jean-Francois stood in the courtyard, blade slick with blood, firelight flickering in his eyes. Around him, the rebels surged like a storm, tearing through the last defenses. T-Noel wiped his machete on a soldier's coat, smirking through soot. Never thought I'd see their faces run white as ghosts. Adeline, hair singed by sparks, tightened her grip on the maps. "We move east after this. The roads will choke with masters fleeing. We strike them before they gather." Cécile pressed herbs into a man's wound, her hands trembling but steady. "The spirits walk with us tonight," she whispered. "But spirits are hungry, they demand more." Then a horn blared. From the ridge, a fresh troop of colonial soldiers stormed down, bayonets gleaming. Georges Biassou steadied his musket. "Hold, let them taste fire before steel." Torches hurled into dry cane, smoke exploding upward. Shots cracked through the night. Rebels fell, blood soaking into earth that had drunk years of sweat. Jean-Francois shouted, "Do not run. Tonight we decide if chains live or die." The charge slammed into them. Blades crashed, muskets fired at close range. Screams tore through the smoke. Etienne's brother, Henri Moreau, appeared on horseback, saber raised. His eyes burned with vengeance. "Kill them all! Leave none breathing!" He swung his saber down, cutting through a rebel's back. Blood sprayed hot onto the soil. Henri laughed cruelly. "This is how dogs are put down." Jean-Francois's gaze fixed on him. Another Moreau to the fire. He lunged forward, parrying the saber with his machete. Sparks flew. Henri snarled, pressing hard. "My brother's death will be yours, beast." Jean-Francois pushed back, gritting his teeth. "Your brother screamed like a coward. You will too." They wrestled in the blaze, horses screaming, men colliding around them. T-Noel slashed a soldier's throat, dragging Henri from his saddle. The horse bolted, crashing into a wall of flame. Henri roared, swinging wildly. His saber sliced across Jean-Francois's arm, blood spilling. Jean-Francois staggered, but his grip tightened on the machete. He struck. Once. Twice. Henri fell, gasping, clutching his stomach. On the ground, he wheezed, "You'll all hang." Jean-Francois leaned close, voice steady. "No, we rise." His blade came down, ending the Moreau line in fire. Nearby, chaos unfolded. A rebel boy no older than 16 clashed with a soldier twice his size. The boy fell, blade clattering. The soldier lifted his bayonet. Cécile screamed, running forward. She smashed her clay jar against the soldier's face, herbs and clay scattering. The soldier cursed, blinded. The boy snatched his machete, plunging it upward. He looked at Cécile with wide eyes. "You saved me," Cécile, shaking, whispered. "No, the spirits did." Adeline climbed the burning steps of the mansion, waving the maps. "The roads are clear. Strike the port next before they regroup." But as she turned, a bullet tore through her shoulder. She stumbled, dropping the maps into the fire. Flames devoured them instantly. "No," she cried, clutching at ashes. Jean-Francois rushed to her, pulling her behind a wall. Blood soaked her dress. "Adeline, stay with me!" She winced, gripping his hand. "Do not waste what we began. Hold still, Cécile." Cécile pressed cloth to the wound, chanting prayers under her breath. Adeline's breath came shallow, eyes glazed with pain. Georges Biassou limped forward, rallying the fighters. Do not let their blood be in vain. Strike harder! The rebels surged again, pushing soldiers back into the blaze. Screams rose as fire consumed flesh and fabric. Muskets cracked, but the smoke blinded both sides. Then, betrayal. A voice shouted, "This way! This way!" From the shadows, Jacques Dumas, once a confidant, beckoned soldiers through a hidden path. His eyes gleamed with greed. "Spare me and I'll give you their leaders!" Jean-François froze, rage flaring. "Jacques," "You snake," Jacques sneered. "I'll live while you roast." But Tainot hurled his machete like a spear. The blade pierced Jacques' chest. He fell back, choking, blood bubbling from his lips. Jean-François spat. "No traitor will outlive us." The tide shifted. Soldiers, leaderless and blinded by smoke, began to falter. Rebels pressed in, cutting them down one by one. The courtyard filled with the stench of charred flesh and gunpowder. Amid the chaos, Jean-François climbed the bell tower. He seized the rope, pulling with all his might. The bell clanged again and again, a call not for prayer but for rebellion. Its iron voice carried across hills and valleys. Other plantations would hear. Other slaves would rise. Below, Etienne's mansion collapsed in fire, roof crashing inward with a roar. Flames devoured portraits, pianos, silks, whips. All the symbols of power turned to ash. Jean-François looked out over the burning horizon, blood dripping from his arm, smoke stinging his eyes. His voice rose above the inferno. "Tonight we are no longer slaves. Tonight we are free men!" The rebels roared back, voices breaking with triumph and grief. "Liberté ou mort!" The last soldiers fell. Silence slowly replaced chaos, broken only by the crackle of flames and the cries of the wounded. Adeline lay pale but breathing, her head resting in Cécile's lap. Georges Biassou stood tall despite his wounds, eyes shining with grim pride. Tainot wiped blood from his face, laughing weakly. Jean-François descended the tower, his steps heavy. He looked at each of them, his chosen family forged in blood and fire. "We have begun something that cannot be undone. The masters will come. The French will come. But so will freedom, and we will meet them all, with fire." The night, now painted in red and black, swallowed his words and carried them like prophecy. Dawn broke over a blackened horizon. The cane fields were nothing but ash and twisted stalks, the mansion reduced to smoldering ruins. Smoke drifted lazily, mingling with the stench of burned flesh. The rebels stood in silence, exhausted, bloodied, eyes hollow. Some clutched wounds. Others clutched stolen bread or weapons. Children wept quietly, their small hands smeared with soot. Jean-François walked through the courtyard, stepping over corpses, masters, soldiers, and rebels alike. His machete dragged at his side, its edge dulled by blood and bone. He paused at Etienne's charred remains, unrecognizable but still crowned with the smell of silk and rum. Jean-François whispered, "You thought chains were eternal. Now you are smoke." Behind him, Tainot coughed, sitting on a broken barrel. "We've won a battle, but war will come. The French will not forgive." Georges Biassou leaned heavily on his musket. "Then let them come. Every plantation will hear the bell we rang." Cécile knelt beside Adeline, who lay pale on a makeshift cot. Her shoulder wound was wrapped in cloth-soaked crimson. Adeline's voice trembled. "Did it spread? Did others see?" Jean-François crouched beside her. "Yes, the hills are burning. We lit the fire. They will not snuff it out." Adeline smiled faintly. "Then my blood was not wasted." She closed her eyes, breathing shallow. From the village beyond, a murmur rose. Survivors, women, elders, children emerged cautiously, eyes wide with awe and fear. Some knelt before Jean-François, whispering, "Leader, deliverer." But others whispered darker words. "He burned his master alive. He'll bring the wrath of France. No mercy will follow this." Jean-François heard both, pride and dread twisting inside him. By midday, drums echoed from the hills. Messengers arrived from neighboring plantations, faces fierce. One spoke, "The fire spreads. Le cap tremble." But the whites gather in militias. "They promise vengeance." Jean-François' jaw tightened. "Let them come. We will not kneel." Yet by nightfall, vengeance had already begun. French troops, rallied by surviving planters, stormed nearby villages. Fires rose again, this time consuming rebel huts. Screams pierced the dark. The cycle of blood turned swiftly. Captured rebels were dragged to the square. Among them was a young boy, the same who had carried Jean-Francois's message to the hills. Chains rattled around his wrists. A French captain sneered, "This child?" He lit torches. "That is rebellion," the boy spat blood. "Liberté ou mort." The captain smiled coldly and slit his throat before the crowd. Gasps broke. Mothers clutched their children tighter. The French laughed. Jean-Francois, hiding among the cane shadows, watched helplessly. His fists shook. Tenuel whispered beside him, "If we strike now, we die. We must wait." Jean-Francois's teeth clenched, but he forced himself still. By morning, the French made examples of more. Rebels were hanged from trees, their bodies left swaying as warnings. Women were whipped until their backs split open. Men were broken on wheels. Cécile covered her ears, tears streaming. "The spirits we fed are feasting now." Adeline, pale but awake, whispered, "Every martyr is a seed. Their cruelty only waters the fire." Days blurred. A trial convened in Le Cap for captured leaders. The hall was filled with colonists, powdered wigs and perfumed coats masking the stench of fear. A magistrate read charges with theatrical venom. Jean-Francois Papillon, Georges Biassou, leaders of insurrection, arsonists, murderers, traitors to the crown. Jean-Francois stood shackled, shoulders squared. He said nothing. A planter shouted from the gallery, "Burn them as they burned us." Another cried, "Hang them high, let the dogs watch!" But murmuring spread among the enslaved crowded outside the hall. They pressed against windows, whispering their own verdicts. He gave us courage. He showed chains can break. He burned one master, but freed 1,000. When called to speak, Jean-Francois raised his head. "You name me traitor. Yet what loyalty do I owe to chains, to whips, to hunger? I was born free, stolen, broken, and still I rise. If fire is my crime, then fire will purify this land." Gasps rippled through the court. The magistrate slammed his gavel. "Silence the savage." Soldiers struck Jean-Francois, but he did not fall. Blood ran down his face, and still he stared with burning eyes. The trial dragged for hours. Georges Biassou spoke fiercely. Tenuel mocked the planters. Cécile prayed aloud to the spirits. Adeline, too weak to stand, remained silent but raised her bandaged hand defiantly. In the end, sentences were declared. Execution for rebels caught in arms, branding and chains for others. But Jean-Francois and his closest lieutenants, too feared, too legendary, were ordered to be shipped under heavy guard, destined for public torture in Le Cap. Yet the transfer never happened. On the march, rebels ambushed the convoy. Chains were broken, soldiers slain, wagons overturned. Jean-Francois escaped into the hills, vanishing into forests thick with smoke. Rumors spread like wildfire. He was hanged. No. He burned the gallows. He sails with Spanish allies. He walks at night, blade dripping, a ghost among flames. The French feared him. The enslaved whispered his name as prayer. Mothers lulled their children with songs of Papillon, the butterfly who rose from ashes. But even as legends grew, so did the cost. Fields lay wasted, villages charred, hundreds dead, hundreds more hunted. The rebellion birthed both freedom and endless grief. Jean-Francois, hidden in the hills, looked out over the scarred land. His voice was quiet, almost breaking. "Every fire eats more than it frees, but still we burn." Cécile beside him placed a trembling hand on his arm. "The spirits chose you. They will not release you now." Jean-Francois closed his eyes, the smoke of dawn curling around him. He knew she was right. The aftermath was no ending, but the beginning of a war that would consume empires. The fire had long died on the plantations, but its smoke lingered in memory. Ashes cooled, yet whispers burned hotter than flame. In the markets of Le Cap, women told stories over baskets of cassava. They say Papillon cut down 20 men, alone. No, he turned into smoke and slipped. Through their muskets. My cousin swears he saw him ride a horse of fire. Children gathered around elders, who spun tales by lamplight. Jean-Francois Papillon, born with a chain around his ankle, but wings on his back. When they whipped him, he grew stronger. When they burned him, he became flame. Each retelling stretched truth into legend. His machete gleamed brighter, his voice thundered louder, his courage swelled into myth. Planters, too, whispered his name, but in fear. In candlelit parlors, they clutched pistols and glanced at the dark hills. Papillon is still alive. He waits for us in the cane. They say he cannot be killed. Spanish bullets pass through him. No. He's no man at all, but a demon summoned by the drums. The French crown declared him outlaw. Traitor, phantom of the rebellion. Pamphlets painted him monstrous. Papillon the butcher, Papillon the firebrand. But the enslaved called him savior. Cécile, walking among the villages, spread stories like seeds. He is not gone. He walks with us. Every torch you lift, every chain you break, Papillon lives there. Adeline, scarred but alive, whispered from her cot. He was a man, just a man. But the masters fear him like they fear the storm. That is his victory. Even Georges Biassou, gruff and scarred, raised his voice to rally fighters. Remember his fire! Papillon lit the path. We march in his smoke. Songs rose, woven into the air like spells. Lullabies twisted into war chants. Papillon with wings of flame. Chains could never bind his name. Masters burn. Their cries the wind, freedom's fire will not rescind. Soon, across the Atlantic, whispers reached Europe. In Paris cafes, revolutionaries spoke of him in awe. A slave general, they marveled, who struck fear into France. In Spanish ports, sailors muttered prayers when storms broke, believing Papillon stirred the waves. His story warped with distance. To some he was hero, to others beast. Yet always his name carried weight. On lonely nights, Jean-Francois himself heard the rumors echo through the hills. He sat by firelight, weary, blood still crusted on his blade. Tinoel laughed as he recited the tales. They say you fly now, Jean, that you ride storms. Jean-Francois stared into the flames. I do not fly. I crawl, I bleed. But if my pain makes them believe, let them believe. Cécile murmured softly. Belief is stronger than chains. You have become more than flesh. You are the story that frightens them. Jean-Francois said nothing. His hand tightened around the talisman, charred and bloodstained. His eyes glimmered with both sorrow and fire. Across Haiti, the name Papillon no longer belonged only to a man. It became a banner, a weapon, a ghost. In the ashes of plantations, in the shadows of cane fields, in the lullabies sung to children who dreamed of freedom, Papillon lived on. History rarely remembers the enslaved by name. They are left as numbers in ledgers, shadows in fields, whispers behind locked doors. But Jean-Francois Papillon broke that silence with fire. His legacy is not measured in titles, nor in wealth, nor in the fragile respect of kings. It is measured in fear he struck into those who believed themselves untouchable. It is measured in hope he kindled among those who thought freedom impossible. He was not flawless. He was not gentle. His justice came with screams and smoke. Yet can one fault the enslaved for turning fire against fire, for answering centuries of chains with the crack of machetes? Every rebellion is painted in blood. The difference lies in whose blood we choose to see. The masters wrote him as savage. The enslaved sang him as savior. Truth lived somewhere between. Perhaps Papillon himself understood this, that he was both man and myth, both soldier and symbol, that in the terror of his enemies and the devotion of his followers lay the same truth. Power is never willingly surrendered. It must be taken, with teeth, with hands, with flame. And so Papillon stands not as a saint, but as a reminder that freedom is born in violence as often as it is in prayer, that history is not written by kings alone, but also by those who refuse to kneel. The cane fields he burned have long turned green again. The mansions rebuilt, the ledgers faded, but the name remains, Papillon. A man, a rebel, a story, a warning. The night closes, the flames dim, and the voices of the past fade into silence. Yet the echoes remain. Jean-Francois Papillon and the rebels of Saint-Domingue remind us that resistance is never born from comfort. It is born from chains, fire, and the courage to defy the impossible. Their story is not just history. It is a mirror. It asks us, what would we endure? What would we risk? What would we burn to be free? Across centuries, rulers, tyrants, and oppressors have sought to bury these names. But stories like Papillon's cannot be buried. They claw their way back through the soil, through the cane fields, through the ash, demanding to be heard. This was not a tale of saints. It was a tale of survivors, of men and women who chose rage over silence, fire over submission. A story of blood and hope bound together. And now, their voices live on here. You have been watching the slave resistance, where history's darkest rebellions Forgotten crimes and untold struggles are brought back to life in the shadows. Subscribe. Share their story. Keep the fire alive because some chains never rust, and some names never die.